you. Education is a human right. And yet, in the last 5 years, 22,000 students and academics in 93 countries have had their education deliberately destroyed. These attacks occur in many forms. Sexual assaults and exploitation of girls and women. Murder and kidnapping of educators and students. Military occupation of schools. These deliberate attacks are committed by those who have political, ideological, religious, and military motives. When education is destroyed like this, it's not difficult to imagine the many horrors that fill the void. Together, we can stop attacks on education. Together, we can protect children's futures. Unite to protect.
A powerful and inspiring message. Indeed, together we can stop attacks on education. Hello from Doha, Ahlan Bikum. Welcome to this historic virtual session to mark the first ever International Day to Protect Education from Attack. My name is Folie Batibo, principal presenter at Al Jazeera English Television, and I'm honored to be your host for this high-level event. We're gathered today to remind the world that education must be a priority and should remain at the top of the global agenda. As we saw a moment ago, the stakes are high and much remains to be done to protect children's rights to education, especially in countries of conflict and insecurity. But there is hope and progress has been made. If we can continue to work together, we can be united to protect education.
The current crisis calls for a concerted global action to ensure a safe and secure environment for students.
Education is the primary instrument of social mobility and integral development.
We owe it to ourselves and indeed to our children to secure a future where the right to an education, the right to attend school, the right to learn and develop is not a privilege, but the norm in a child's life.
Now, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, school closures are affecting 90% of the world's student population.
Decimated learning resources and traumatized students and teachers are becoming all too commonplace.
In situations of conflict, poverty, humanitarian crisis, or health emergency, we must avoid a generational catastrophe.
Pour s'assurer que nous construisons les sociétés que nous voulons, il va falloir construire une éducation à la paix pour l'ensemble de l'humanité.
Hundreds of millions of children are under severe attack. Their freedom, safety, education, and even childhood in severe danger.
It means protecting education from potential threats and risks like terrorism, war, armed conflicts, extremism, and also from poverty and diseases.
Over 250 million children are still out of school because of barriers such as discrimination, conflict, and poverty. We owe it to all children to protect their access to quality education.
We have the power to ensure that no one go without quality education, particularly those already living amid the trauma and tragedies of conflict.
We see firsthand that the foundations of our future are at stake, and that education cannot be taken for granted.
In the most conflict-stricken areas of the world lie brilliant minds.
Education helps build peaceful societies, prevents radicalism, and reduces violent crime.
It is the first necessary step to protecting our children from attacks on their education and showing our global commitment to students from all over the world.
A strong call to action from world leaders, campaigners, artists, and activists on this first International Day to protect education from attack. And we're honored by the presence of world leaders today. Their participation not only demonstrates global leadership and support for the need to protect education from attack, but it also provides a global forum to exchange ideas on how we can all help. So I'd like to invite all of you, our audience, to join in on this conversation on social media channels using the hashtag #UniteToProtect, which is on your screen right now. Now, on the 28th of May, the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution that brought this day into being following a call for action by Her Highness Sheikha Moussa bint Nasser, the chairperson of Education Above All Foundation and UN Sustainable Development Goals advocate. Her Highness identified the need for an international day to shine a light on the plight of more than 75 million children and young people who are currently in urgent need to have safe and quality education in 35 crisis-affected countries. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's now my honor to invite Her Highness Sheikha Moussa bint Nasser, the chairperson of Education Above All Foundation and UN Sustainable Goals advocate, to give her address on this International Day to protect education from attack. Your Highness.
Thank you. السلام عليكم. قبل حوالي عام كما تعلمون دعوت إلى تخصيص يوم عالمي لحماية التعليم من الاعتداءات. عندما استبشرنا خيراً باعتماد الأمم المتحدة لهذه المناسبة بوصفها وقفة سنوية لمراجعة مستويات التقدم، كنا ندرك أن جدية الالتزام تتجلى في مدى الاستجابة في مواجهة التحديات، وهي تحديات تكبر وتتكاثر وتتنوع. أقول هذا وليفارق ذاكرتي مشهد أشلاء 40 طفلاً ودماء 56 جريحاً وقد تبعثرت حقائبهم المدرسية وتناثرت دفاترهم مشرعة صفحاتها بالإدانة، شاهدة على جريمة ترتكب عندما قصفت طائرة حربية باصاً مدرسياً في أغسطس من عام 2018 بمحافظة صعدة اليمنية. وهو عمل وحشي أفلت من عقابه الجنان، كما أفلت آخرون من جرائم تكررت في دول أخرى، حيث أبلغت بيانات حديثة عن أكثر من 11,000 هجوم على التعليم في السنوات الخمس الماضية. قتل أو جرح خلالها 22,000 من الطلبة والمعلمين والأكاديميين في أكثر من 93 دولة. وبينما نعمل على محو الأمية، هناك من يعملون على نشر الأمية، وكأن ثمة هجوما ممنهجا على كل من وما يهدف إلى بناء الإنسان، ولعلها أمية الضمائر التي تتنافر دائما مع صحوة العقول. ولأننا جميعا نعرف الداء والدواء، يؤسفني أن أشعر أن مثلنا كمثل من يصف الدواء ولا يستطيع صرفه. فمن الوقائع المحبطة أن نفتتح مدارس في دولة ما بينما تستهدف وتدمر مدارس بنيناها في دولة أخرى. ولأن الهدم بطبيعته أسهل من البناء، فإن تدمير المدارس أسرع من بنائها، الأمر الذي باطئ خطواتنا أو يعيدنا إلى الوراء. وقد يرى البعض أن من الطرف الفكري أن انشغل بتوفير التعليم إبان الحروب، لكنني أرى في ذلك بالمقابل تهميشاً لأولوية التعليم التي تشكل خياراً لا ينافسه خيار بالنسبة إلى أمهات يعيشن في مخيمات تفتقر إلى أبسط شروط الحياة، ويدركنا بالرغم من قسوة الظروف أن الأمل الذي يصنعه التعليم هو السبيل الأمثل إلى الأمن والاستقرار. ومن الوقائع المحبطة في بؤر النزاعات إلى الوقائع المحبطة في مكاتب صناعة القرار، ونحن نرى كيف أدى هذا العدد الهائل من الاعتداءات إلى تكريس العجز الأممي عن ردعها، حينما بدأ المجتمع الدولي وإن عن غير قصد، كما لو أنه متواطئ مع هذه الانتهاكات بسبب تخاذله في تقديم الجناه إلى العدالة. والحال هذه لابد من مغادرة هذه المنطقة الرمادية باتخاذ مواقف مسؤولة فلم يعد الدعم اللفظي الذي نتلقاه من المجتمع الدولي كافياً في غياب إجراءات عملية جادة. ينبغي أن لا يظل أصحاب القرار مختبئين في دائرة الأقوال دون أن يقدموا على الخروج إلى فضاء الأفعال. ولكننا بالرغم من كل ذلك نتوخى من أصحاب إرادات الخيرة في العالم أن يجتمعوا على الموقف الرادع كي لا يصبح العجز موقفاً رسمياً. لا نريد لهذا اليوم أن يكون مجرد يوم احتفالي على جدول الأمم المتحدة دون أن يكون لحماية التعليم تجسيد واقعي على الأرض يتطابق مع مفهوم الحماية. ولا أظن أن دولة أو هيئة أو شخصية ترضى بأن يلحق بها عار تاريخي أنها صمتت أو تواطأت أو تساهلت حيال القتل المتعمد لأطفال يجلسون في قاعات دراسية ظنوا أنها آمنة. ولكي ينفي أصحاب القرار عن أنفسهم تهمة محتملة كهذه ينبغي أن يسارعوا إلى إقرار آليات فعالة لمساءلة مرتكبي هذه الجرائم. وإذا ما واظبنا على رصد الاعتداءات سنضع حداً لإفلاتهم من عقاب سيطالهم عاجلاً أو آجلاً. إن حياة وتعليم ومستقبل هؤلاء الأطفال مسؤولية تضع المجتمع الدولي في اختبار لا يجوز الفشل فيه، لأن إنسانيتنا تختبر في مثل هذه المواقف. فلنكن معاً لحماية التعليم. شكراً.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Highness, for underlining the importance of ensuring that September 9th is an annual day that can lead to real change to protect education from attack. Now, earlier this year, when the UN General Assembly unanimously decided to establish the International Day to Protect Education from Attack, our next distinguished guest called for the urgent protection of children and youth in conflict zones, especially during this global pandemic, saying our children must have a safe and secure environment in which to learn. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to introduce to you now His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations.
Your Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to join you for the first observance of the International Day to Protect Education from Attack. I thank the State of Qatar, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Education Above All Foundation for organizing this high-level event. Education is a fundamental human right. It is an essential driver for fostering peace, promoting just societies, and supporting sustainable development. Without quality education for all, we cannot eliminate poverty, tackle inequality, fight climate change, or promote peace. Without education, we simply cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In the words of philosopher Hannah Arendt, the task of, and I quote, renewing a common world. But too often, the right to education falls under attack, especially in conflict-affected areas where entire populations can be denied learning. Violence against education can take various forms, targeting education facilities, students, teachers, and education personnel. Today, attacks on education due to conflict and insecurity are on the rise. Between 2015 and 2019, there were some 11,000 reported armed attacks on education. In addition to depriving millions of vulnerable learners from accessing education, this violence has serious adverse effects, including increased dropout rates, prolonged educational disruption, child recruitment into armed groups, early pregnancy, and sexual violence. These attacks simply must not continue. I urge all member states to honor their commitments under existing international agreements that prohibit attacks on the right to education. Schools and universities are supposed to be safe spaces where learners can grow, develop, and be empowered. I welcome steps taken by member states to protect educational institutions and those who need them. These include the Safe Schools Declaration, which aims to protect education from attack and to prevent schools and universities from being used for military purposes. To date, 104 countries have endorsed this declaration, but we need more. First, we need to ensure that when it comes to education, all means all. I urge all United Nations member states to ensure the provision of education for all, even in times of conflict, and particularly for the most vulnerable, such as refugees and displaced persons. In protecting education from attack, we must also use education as a force to prevent attacks. That is why the United Nations is working to prevent violent extremism through education. We are helping young people rise above radical messages to build more peaceful societies. By giving them more autonomy and raising awareness of human rights, we are building the foundations of durable peace. Second, we need to improve our knowledge of attacks on education. This means enhancing monitoring, reporting, and investigation of attacks so the perpetrators can be held to account. Initiatives such as the Education Under Attack report provide an important contribution as they document targeted and indiscriminate attacks on schools and universities around the world. Finally, we must use recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity to build a better world. The pandemic has shed an important light on the fault lines running throughout societies. One of these is unequal access to education. As we work to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals over the coming decade, we must ensure that no one is left behind. And for that, we need quality education for all and safe places for students to learn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, for highlighting UN action to protect education around the world. Now, we're also honored to be joined by the President of the 74th session of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency Professor Tijani Muhammad Bande. Your Excellency.
Your Highness, Sheikh Ahmad bin Nasser, Chairperson of Education Above All Foundation and UN Sustainable Development Goals Advocate, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the State of Qatar, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Education Above All Foundation for organizing today's virtual high-level event. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that education is one of the public services that most vulnerable to external shocks. In fragile contexts, education is one of the first to be impacted by conflict and violence. It's critical that we continue to advocate for the cessation of hostilities and the protection of civilians while we respond to the fallout of the coronavirus pandemic. Today, more countries are experiencing violent conflict than in the 3 decades since the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Violent conflict has resulted in the displacement of more than 30 million children. The threat of disruption of education has in turn triggered displacement. To this end, I welcome the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire and uphold the work of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, as well as the United Nations peacekeeping troops and personnel on the front lines. Equal access to quality education has been an overarching priority of the 74th session of the General Assembly. I commend the government and people of Qatar and all the 62 co-sponsoring member states for bringing this critical issue to the attention of the world. In adopting Resolution 72/275 to establish the International Day to Protect Education from Attack, the entire membership of the General Assembly upheld the values underpinning the Charter of the United Nations while working remotely to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. Excellencies, in 2015, we adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and committed to achieving equal access to quality education for all. Yet, since then, there have been over 7,300 attacks on education. 2/3 of these were direct attacks on schools, including arson, ground and air strikes, raids, looting, and the use of explosive devices. We are witnessing the military occupation of schools, which causes the campus or campuses to lose civilian status, thus facing threats of attack as a lawful military target. Furthermore, proximity to weapon bearers places students at risk of forced recruitment, sexual violence, and abduction. It is most disturbing, Excellencies, that 70 years after the Geneva Convention came into being, we must continue to remind the world that students, teachers, and schools are protected as civilians and civilian objects under international humanitarian law. We must take urgent actions to protect and uphold the rights of children in all circumstances. No one is above the law, and all perpetrators of attacks on education should be held accountable. I call on member states who have not already done so to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration and to support UNICEF's change agenda. We must invest in strengthening the monitoring and reporting of attacks on education and disaggregate this data to improve our response to attacks on education. In post-conflict settings, we must give high priority to education. Rebuilding education systems is the foundation of peace building, the critical action to break the cycle of fragility. Education provides youth with the analytical skills, tolerance, and coping mechanisms required to navigate life changes. The Global Partnership for Education estimates that each year of education reduces the risk of involvement in conflict by approximately 20%. We must provide flexible and accelerated funding to ensure continuity of education. This requires transitional education planning, teacher training, and the adoption of innovative solutions such as UNICEF's community-based education and radio programming. Excellencies, in closing, in this decade of action and deliberate to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, we must convene all stakeholders to take transformative actions in order to create a better world. Let this inaugural International Day to protect education from attack be the catalyst for progress as we strive together to deliver for all. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency, for the UN General Assembly's continued commitment to strengthen processes that safeguard quality education in conflict situation. Thank you also once again to His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his continued commitment to this cause. And I'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank Her Highness, Sheikha Musa bint Nasser, for her leadership and vision. And now for the second part of our discussion today, we'll focus on the global action that's already been taken to safeguard education and explore what remains to be done. For over a decade, since the 2010 Education in Emergencies UN General Assembly resolution through to the establishment of the UN International Day to Protect Education from Attack, Qatar has championed and remained committed to the protection of education and has ensured that it is a priority on the global agenda. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar, His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صاحبة السمو الشيخة موزة بنت ناصر، رئيس مجلس إدارة مؤسسة قطر للتربية والعلوم وتنمية المجتمع، ورئيس مؤسسة التعليم فوق الجميع، سعادة السيد أنطونيو غوتيريش الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، سعادة السفير تيجاني محمد بندي رئيس الدورة 74 للجمعية العامة، أصحاب السعادة السيدات والسادة، إن من دواعي سرورنا واعتزازنا أن تستضيف دولة قطر بالاشتراك مع منظمة اليونسكو ومنظمة اليونيسف ومؤسسة التعليم فوق الجميع هذا الحدث الرفيع المستوى الذي يعقد لأول مرة لإحياء اليوم الدولي لحماية التعليم من الهجمات، وبمشاركة كريمة من صاحبة السمو الشيخة موزة بنت ناصر وسعادة الأمين العام وسعادة رئيس الجمعية العامة ونخبة مرموقة من الشخصيات المعروفة بمساهماتها الإنسانية. نجتمع اليوم لمتابعة تنفيذ قرار الجمعية العامة A/74/275 الذي قدمته دولة قطر بإعلان يوم 9 سبتمبر اليوم العالمي لحماية التعليم من الهجمات، ويحدون الفخر والتقدير لصاحبة السمو الشيخة موزة بنت ناصر، حيث كانت سموها القوة الدافعة وراء هذه المبادرة كغيرها من المبادرات الإنسانية والتنموية البالغة التأثير في مختلف مناطق العالم. وكما نهضت سموها بدور قيادي دولي لتحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة للأمم المتحدة، فإنها تواصل جهودها القيمة والمشهود لها لحماية وتوفير التعليم الجيد في جميع أنحاء العالم لأشد الأطفال تهميشا، ولضمان قدرتهم على الذهاب إلى المدارس في بيئة آمنة وسليمة. إن أهمية انعقاد هذا الحدث في هذا الوقت تكمن بأنه يتزامن مع الظروف الاستثنائية والمؤلمة الناجمة عن جائحة كورونا كوفيد-19 التي تطال أكثر من 75 مليون طفلا وشاب بحاجة ماسة لتقديم الدعم التعليمي في 35 بلدا متضررا من الأزمات. كما يمثل الحدث رسالة من هذه النخبة الرفيعة بأن التعليم يمكن أن يكون أداة فعالة ومؤثرة لإحداث التحولات الإيجابية في المجتمعات، وتجعل من الأزمات فرصة لتعزيز التعاون والتآزر، وبما يصب في مصلحة الجميع ويخلق عالم يسوده السلام والازدهار والكرامة الإنسانية. ومن هنا فإن هذا الحدث الرفيع يمثل مناسبة هامة للدعوة لوضع حد للهجمات المتعمدة التي تستهدف التعليم والعنف المسلح الذي يعاني منها الأطفال والمعلمون والمدارس وسائر المؤسسات التعليمية في جميع أنحاء العالم، ودون اعتبار الآثار المدمرة لتلك الاعتداءات على آمال وطموحات الأطفال والشباب وآثارها السلبية على التنمية المستدامة والسلام وحقوق الإنسان. لذلك فإن دولة قطر يحدوها الأمل بأن يسترشد الطلبة والشباب بهذا اليوم وأن يسخروه لرفع الوعي والضغط لإنهاء الهجمات على المؤسسات التعليمية وحمايتها وتحقيق أحلام الأطفال والشباب بكونهم بناة المستقبل وأمل الشعوب والإنسانية. أصحاب السعادة الحضور الكرام، تماشيا مع التزام دولة قطر وشراكتها مع المجتمع الدولي لتحقيق السلام والتنمية وحماية حقوق الإنسان، فإنها حرصت على التعاون والعمل مع الشركاء في إطار الأمم المتحدة وخارجها لتوفير البيئة الملائمة لتمكين الأطفال والشباب من الحصول على التعليم الجيد. وانطلاقا من المسؤولية الملقاة على دولة قطر كعضو في الأمم المتحدة وشريك لمواجهة التحديات المشتركة، فإنها لم تتوانى عن بذل الجهود لمنع تسوية النزاعات بالسبل السلمية، وذلك للآثار المدمرة لتلك النزاعات على مختلف أوجه الحياة، ولا سيما الفئات الضعيفة وفي مقدمتها الأطفال والشباب. لذلك وبتوجيه من حضرة صاحب السمو أمير دولة قطر حفظه الله، فإن تمويل التعليم في حالات الطوارئ يتسم بالأولوية في المساعدات الإنمائية المقدمة من دولة قطر. وفي هذا الخصوص فقد استفاد من مبادرات دولة قطر من خلال مؤسسة التعليم فوق الجميع وشركائها، وبدعم من صندوق قطر للتنمية، الملايين من الأطفال غير الملتحقين بالمدارس في أكثر من 78 بلدا، إضافة إلى العديد من المبادرات والبرامج التي لا يتسع وقت الاجتماع للحديث عنها. يشكل التعليم أداة رئيسية وفعالة للتنمية والازدهار ولإعادة بناء الاقتصادات والمجتمعات التي مزقتها النزاعات والأزمات. وفي هذا السياق فقد أظهرت جائحة كوفيد-19 عدم المساواة الهيكلية القائم في مجال التعليم في بعض الدول والحاجة الملحة إلى التصدي له، حيث أن الأطفال والشباب هم الأكثر تأثرا من هذه الجائحة. ومن هذا المنطلق ولما يمثله التعليم كأولوية في سياسة دولة قطر، فإنها ستواصل التزامها من أجل جعل التعليم متاحا لملايين الأطفال المحرومين وحماية المؤسسات التعليمية. وأشكركم لحسن استماعكم.
Thank you. Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs for the State of Qatar for the update on what the State of Qatar is doing to advance this initiative. Now, Belgium has been appointed as the chair of the Working Group of Children in Armed Conflict and is a member of the UN Security Council in this critical time for education for marginalized, vulnerable children. Please help me welcome now His Excellency Philippe Goffin, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense for the Kingdom of Belgium.
Thank you, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de saluer les efforts de Son Altesse Sheikha Moza bint Nasser, présidente de la Fondation Education Above All, ainsi que les efforts de l'État du Qatar qui ont abouti à l'adoption à l'unanimité de la résolution coparrainée par la Belgique condamnant les attaques contre les écoles et proclamant le 9 septembre Journée internationale pour la protection de l'éducation contre les attaques. L'année dernière, l'ONU a recensé près de 500 attaques contre des écoles en différentes zones de conflit. Ce chiffre représente une quantité inacceptable d'histoires individuelles d'éducation interrompue, d'avenir brisé ou encore d'atteintes portées au caractère sacré des écoles en tant qu'espace sûr, d'atteinte aux enseignants, d'atteinte aux étudiants et d'atteinte aux élèves. Ces chiffres et ce constat nous mobilisent tous. C'est ce qui a inspiré la présidence nigérienne à mettre les attaques à l'ordre du jour du Conseil de sécurité de demain. La Belgique apporte son plein soutien à la déclaration présidentielle que le Niger présentera sur le sujet. La Journée internationale pour la protection de l'éducation contre les attaques sert de signal d'alarme fort, clair et opportun pour l'ensemble de la communauté internationale et plus particulièrement à l'attention de tous les responsables politiques. En effet, c'est à nous, en tant qu'État, de fournir une protection et d'assurer une éducation de qualité inclusive et équitable. C'est à nous de défendre le droit à l'éducation. C'est à nous de veiller à ce que les auteurs des attaques soient traduits en justice. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, la lutte contre l'impunité est la pierre angulaire de la politique étrangère de la Belgique. La présidence belge du groupe de travail du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies sur le sort des enfants en temps de conflit armé s'inscrit pleinement dans cet engagement. Au-delà de notre action au sein du Conseil de sécurité, la Belgique joue également un rôle de premier plan dans la lutte contre les violations des droits de l'enfant dans les conflits armés, y compris les attaques contre les écoles. La Belgique s'engage sur plusieurs fronts à cet égard. Par exemple, le soutien belge au programme Education in Emergency de l'UNRWA et a contribué aux services éducatifs essentiels à plus de 300 000 enfants réfugiés palestiniens en Syrie, au Liban, en Jordanie, à Gaza et en Cisjordanie. Depuis plusieurs années, notre pays apporte aussi une aide financière substantielle à l'UNICEF afin de documenter de façon systématique les violations des droits de l'enfant dans les conflits armés. Mettre en évidence les violations des droits de l'enfant et dénoncer leurs auteurs sont en effet des actions préalables indispensables pour traiter le problème. Une action résolue et une pression politique constante restent indispensables. La Belgique continue à s'engager dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre, pour votre engagement et votre soutien. Thank you very much, Mr. Goffin, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence for the Kingdom of Belgium. Now, as we know, there are millions of children all over the world living in situations of armed conflict and humanitarian emergency. The International Committee of the Red Cross has been on the front lines, providing assistance and safeguarding access to education for children who live in armed conflict. It's now my pleasure to welcome the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mr. Peter Maurer.
Excellencies, congratulations to Your Highness Sheikh Hamouza bint Nasser and the State of Qatar on your dedicated efforts to advance on this critical issue. This week, I'm traveling to the Sahel region to visit ICRC operations and discuss our humanitarian concerns with authorities. As in many violent places around the world, the children of the Sahel have suffered enormously during conflict, including the loss of their schooling. I have stood in the ruins of schools in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Classrooms bombed, fired upon, teachers threatened. Schools have become treacherous places instead of refuges for learning and opportunity. Attacks on education are attacks on the future potential of individuals, communities, and entire countries. An international humanitarian law is clear. During conflict, education must not be targeted. Parties must protect students, educational personnel, schools, and other educational facilities. The ICRC is pleased to see the rules of IHL and the priority to facilitate access to education reflected in the resolution to establish the International Day to protect education from attack. Now we need to see better behaviors on the battlefields. The ICRC is well placed to respond when educational systems are plunged into crisis. Through our contact with authorities and weapon bearers, our proximity to affected communities, and our access to hard-to-reach areas. We will keep working to safeguard schools and communities through risk awareness training, introducing protective security measures to school buildings, providing mental health support to teachers, and providing vocational training to people detained. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic has sparked a new education crisis on a massive scale. I fear especially for vulnerable children and youth impacted by violence, displacement, and protracted conflict. In response to this new crisis, ICRC has designed a multidisciplinary approach from facilitating electronic learning to promoting hygiene and providing psychosocial support to teachers. We certainly all need to be smarter and better in cooperating and leveraging our complementary strength. Collectively, we need to do more. I hope this International Day is a clear rallying calling for action. We must not simply help people survive. We must enable lives of dignity and opportunity. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Mr. Peter Maurer for highlighting the important work of the ICRC. And now we're privileged to hear from Mr. David Beckham, speaking today in his capacity as UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador and the founder of the 7 Fund for UNICEF. Mr. Beckham.
Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be here with you all today. Firstly, my sincere thanks to Her Highness Sheikha Moza bin Nasser for inviting me to lend my voice to those fighting for education for children around the world. Your Highness, thank you for your commitment to education and for providing this forum at such a crucial time in our world. For 15 years, I have been proud to work with UNICEF as a global ambassador. 5 years ago, in partner with UNICEF, I launched the 7 Fund for Children, and together we advocate for the rights of children and particularly for their right to healthcare and education. I know from my work with UNICEF just how lucky I was as a child. I was blessed to have a supportive family and also access to education with teachers and coaches who encouraged me and helped me to achieve my dreams. We know that children want to learn. They want to go to school, to be in class with their teachers and be among their friends in a safe environment. This should not be a luxury for any child. This is their right. Sadly, continued conflict around the world is affecting the future of entire generations of children. And this year, a new horror for children to face. COVID-19 has ripped through communities, taken lives, threatened livelihoods, and disrupted education for many millions. Children's physical health has been threatened, and so has their mental health, at a time when many are being denied access to education as schools address the impact of the pandemic. So, education and our fight for access for all has never been more important. Education is a foundation for peace and prosperity. It can make or break a child's future. 5 years ago, I went to Nepal to visit the temporary learning centres that UNICEF had helped set up following the devastating earthquakes there. The boys and girls that I met just wanted to go back to school and back to normality, to be supported to fulfil their potential after the catastrophic earthquake. These schools and the work that UNICEF was doing to support families offered so many children who had lost everything a place to return to learning, playing, and processing what had just happened to them. In time, with our help, they could be kids once again. I also visited the Philippines in 2014 in the wake of Typhoon Haiyan, and there I saw UNICEF's vital emergency work for children. I visited Santo Nino School in Tanawan, where, thanks to UNICEF, children from the worst hit areas were back in school in makeshift classrooms. To see the difference this made to those children who had been through such a traumatic experience was truly moving. I met an 8-year-old girl called Venus, who was attending a UNICEF-supported school in the aftermath of the typhoon. Through UNICEF's work, children like Venus will be supported and given the help that they need, and that is so incredibly important to me. Amid the chaos of war and conflict, safe spaces to learn are even more important. Without access to education, a generation of children living in conflict will grow up without the skills they need to contribute to a more stable and peaceful future. So today, the International Day to Protect Education from Attack is such an important day for all of us to focus on our responsibilities to the children around the world. It reminds us that we are all accountable. All countries, all people are responsible for preventing attacks on education. Ultimately, children need peace, but while wars, conflict, and disasters continue, UNICEF and its partners can help to protect living through conflict and provide the support and opportunities children need to cope, to recover, and to thrive once again. Thank you for welcoming me here today in my role as a Goodwill Global Ambassador for UNICEF, to share some of my thoughts and to shine a light on the incredible work that UNICEF continues to do for children around the world. It is my pleasure to join you all in this mission to protect children today and in the future. Thank you.
Indeed, we are all accountable. Thank you very much, Mr. Beckham, for sharing your passion with us. And with that, I'd like to thank all of our keynote speakers today for their time and commitment to the International Day to Protect Education from Attack and the valuable insights they've shared with us. Now, as we've heard, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the education of students across the world this year, especially those living in conflict situations. Let's now hear from 3 students who originate from countries where education is frequently under attack.
Prior to become a journalist, I'm saddened to see how many children and students are affected by attacks on school. Unfortunately, this is still a global issue affecting many communities. I'm here today on First International Day to Protect Education from Attack to add my voice to call the global community to stop attacks on education all around the world.
When education comes under attack, women and girls suffer the most. Times of insecurity are when we are most vulnerable. We face the threats of child marriage, domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual abuse. The impact of this can extend across generations. But I choose to believe in hope. As a girl, I chose education, and I chose peace.
I am proud to be part of this important occasion. I know the value of education in developing a sustainable world. Although I have been fortunate to have completed my own education, I know this is not the same reality for many. I have witnessed fellow students jump out of school building in fear of attacks and violence. Can we really build back better? If the most important tool, education itself, is under attack, we must commit to making classrooms a safe space where learners can flourish and look at a bright future. Thank you.
3 distinct voices from 3 different parts of the world, but one clear message: protect education at all costs. The urgency of our cause today is even more amplified by the severe impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on children's access to education everywhere. At its peak, the health crisis forced 1.6 billion children out of school, representing about 90% of the world's students in more than 190 countries. The pandemic has simply been catastrophic for education in every part of the world, especially for children and youth in poor communities and conflict zones who were already struggling to attend school. Many simply don't have the luxury of taking part in distance learning, since most don't have access to laptops or internet connection. Now, this global emergency has highlighted, therefore, the long existing inequalities in education and the urgent need to address them. So we're eager to hear from leaders of international organizations like the UN and others to shed light on their vision for the International Day and how they'll tackle the problem of attacks on education in the COVID-19 era. How can we galvanize support during this day to build back a better education system for all children? Our co-partners for this high-level event are UNICEF and UNESCO, and we look forward to learning from their experiences and how their agencies work together across the UN system to address challenges. So let me now introduce our high-level panel with 8 distinguished guests. Ladies and gentlemen, we're joined by Henrietta Fore, the Executive Director of UNICEF, Stefania Giannini, the Assistant Director General of UNESCO. Also with us, Her Excellency Virginia Gamba, United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. Hassan Al-Tawadi is Secretary General of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy of the State of Qatar. With us as well, Dr. Howard Taylor, Executive Director of the End Violence Partnership. Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim is President of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad and Sustainable Development Goals Advocate of the Secretary General. Diani Joan is Executive Director of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. And Muzoon Al-Melihan, UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, Syrian refugee, and education activist. A very warm welcome to you all. We're very pleased to have you with us today. Let me start with you, Ms. Henrietta Fore, Executive Director of UNICEF. Ms. Fore, COVID-19, as we've heard, has disrupted the education of many of the most marginalized and vulnerable children. And we know that schools are crucial to the health and well-being of these children. What are your priorities to safeguard the education for children in conflict zones and ensure that they are safe to learn and play?
So, Folly, it's a big order for all of us with 1 billion children out of school, but it's a very important one. You are right that what COVID-19 has done is it's brought into stark contrast the inequalities in our world, and that there are many children, the most marginalized, or those who are in conflict situations or fleeing from conflict, that they really have a very difficult time at this moment in the world. The number of attacks on schools has been increasing, so it's an added challenge. But schools provide something more for children. They provide a routine, they provide a psychosocial support, they provide often nutrition. So they are a place of haven, it is a place of learning, it is an important place for a child's life. You also mentioned where they can be safe and play. So it's important that there are education toolkits, which UNICEF and our partners, UNESCO and others, are all part of. Textbooks, tents for temporary schools. We rebuild learning spaces and we train teachers. We do counseling and psychosocial support. And in the time of COVID, we really need distance learning, radio, television, and cell phones.
Right. The schools are indeed a place of safe haven, as you say, for many children. If I can ask you a follow-up question, Ms. Fore, how is UNICEF planning to ensure those children living in conflict situations with the greatest risk of dropping out actually remain in school?
Yes, it's particularly an issue for girls. We're very worried that many of the poorest girls in the poorest countries will not have a chance to return to school. And while we are all celebrating in developed countries children returning to school, there will be many children who will not be returning to school and have no school to return to. And as a result, it's going to be very, very important that as a world, we step up our distance learning. We have a chance with a couple of new programs. One is GIGA and one is Generation Unlimited, in which we are trying to connect every school in the world to the internet, every learner to the internet, every teacher, so that they can become a place where students can reach them even if the schools are closed. But this will be important for our future as a world. We think it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do so, and a very important one. But on this very, very important day, we want to be a clear and strong voice with Her Highness. Stop attacks on education and protect children's futures. We urge all parties to conflict to end attacks on education urgently and now.
Well, we hope your call is indeed heard. Thank you very much, Ms. Ford, for your remarks on UNICEF's role in this very important campaign for us. Let's now turn to Ms. Stefania Giannini. She's the Assistant Director General of UNESCO. If you can give us, Ms. Giannini, an update on what UNESCO has been doing to address attacks on education.
Thank you very much. And let me first of all invite to take a moment to recall on this first important International Day to protect education from attack, that the COVID-19 pandemic has really created the largest disruption of education systems in history. I don't want to go back to numbers you already mentioned, but let me say that this crisis definitely amplifies, exacerbates education disparities, inequality for those most vulnerable learners living in conflict settings. So what are we doing to address this topic differently? While applying our greatest force all together in a new kind of partnership with UNICEF, with all other partners in UN systems and outside, it's about ensuring that all children have access to education. But we realize from the very beginning that access to connectivity become in many contexts a prerequisite, a condition for ensuring the right to education. And we are committed to building a more resilient education systems worldwide. And we are working to place technology as a robust, immediate solution to ensure continuity of learning when learners cannot access education in schools, be it due to conflicts or pandemics. And this is very much about also trying to leverage hybrid learning systems. To this end, UNESCO has supported ministries of education around the world to set up distance learning solutions, leveraging high tech, but at the same time also low tech and no tech approaches. UNESCO has assisted 35 ministries of education in developing places to prevent and address the impact of COVID-19 in crisis and conflict settings. Well, let me say that to bounce back this crisis as inclusive and empowered society, we have to urge all actors to strengthen education financing and remain united in the quest to protect education from attack. And this is a joint Her Highness Sheikh Moza in her call for action.
Remain united. Thank you very much, Ms. Giannini, for your commitment in building a more resilient education system. Indeed, as we've heard from our partners, UNESCO and UNICEF, our strength as a global community lies in our ability to collaborate across sectors and adapt to the challenges we all face. Your Excellency, Ms. Virginia Gamba, as the United Nations Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, what would you say is your #1 priority in leading your organization's agenda in relation to education-related grave violations against children?
Well, in 2019, my office verified hundreds of attacks on schools, as well as military use of schools in the conflict situations we monitor. Schools were looted, burned, shelled, shot at, and demolished. Some schools were occupied by armed groups or forces, denying their use to children. Boys attending school were abducted, recruited, or hurt. For girls, it was even worse. They were abducted, sexually abused, forcibly married, trafficked, or killed. Parents are fearful of sending their children to school, and teachers leave school for lack of safety. The consequences of these attacks on the well-being and long-term development of these children is immense. My priority is to advocate for and research into better protection of schools and students from attack and ensure quality education for reintegrated children. My office will shortly open a research hub in Doha so that we, together with our United Nations and civil society partners, can develop ways to improve capacity building, accountability, monitoring, and prevention of attacks on schools and education. And I want to thank the State of Qatar and Education above all for organizing this first commemoration. This event must become a yearly call to action to better protect education for children in situations of armed conflict. So let us unite and act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency, Ms. Gamba, for those remarks. Let's now bring in Mr. Hassan Al-Tawadi to the conversation. Mr. Tawadi, you're the Secretary General of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy of the State of Qatar. The Qatar World Cup 2022 made very specific promises during the bid process to host the tournament nearly a decade ago, 10 years ago. And these promises focus in part on the important legacy it will leave behind. Can you give us an update on that and also how it helps tackle the core aim of this International Day to protect education from attack?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking Her Highness Sheikh Hamza. Her Highness's leadership on education over the years has been inspirational for our country as well as the global community. Now, today's event is a manifestation of her deep commitment to providing hope and opportunities that serve to protect education in parts of our world where children are most vulnerable. Now, protecting education from attack is an important tenet of the State of Qatar's international commitments. Our country is steadfast in wanting to resolve conflict through dialogue and negotiation. And without a doubt, sports, and football in particular, can play an extremely important role in contributing to that protection. Now, sports teaches us so much. It allows self-expression, it develops character, it fosters a freedom of spirit. And in Qatar, we're using the World Cup in 2022 and the power of football to protect and encourage education for all. Now, how do we do this? We're doing this through a program called Generation Amazing. It's a critical pillar in Qatar 2022's legacy plans. We work in a number of current and former conflict zones with numerous partners, education above all being one of them, one of the most important partners, helping to empower boys and girls and the wider communities that they live in every day. Now, to give you an example of the success of Generation Amazing, I'd like to tell you a story of Mahira Ahmed Mianji from Karachi in Pakistan. In 2013, Mahira started an NGO called Woman is a Nation, WIN, focused on advocacy for women's education. Unfortunately, after numerous threats on her life as well as her family's, she reluctantly stepped away from her work. In 2015, she joined a Generation Amazing program. She discovered the joy of football. It assisted in building her confidence, communication, and leadership skills. But also, more importantly, she met like-minded people that encouraged her and supported her to resume her work. And with what can only be described as immense courage, she went on to revive her program, WIN, which has now been rightly recognized by the UN and provided a long-lasting impact within her community. Now, her story inspires me to ensure that Generation Amazing lives on long after 2022. While we're continuing our plans to welcome the world for what will be undoubtedly an unforgettable World Cup, for us, long after the winning team has lifted the trophy, the legacy of the tournament will continue to resonate in the stories of Mahira and others that continue to strive for education, aided by the special power and the transformational potential of sports.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Tawadi. And I know that we're all looking forward to the Qatar World Cup in 2022. Thank you for your remarks. Dr. Taylor, let me turn to you now. As Executive Director of the End Violence Partnership, what would you say governments should do more? What more can they do to protect children's right to education and make sure that they're safe to learn, particularly in situations of insecurity and armed conflict?
Thanks, Wally. We know that during armed conflict, children can be at risk on their way to and from school and also while they're at school. And that includes children who experience violence from teachers and from other children. And we also know that that undermines their health, their education, their well-being, and their development. Sometimes that has lifelong implications for the children as they grow up, for families, communities, and for economies. At the End Violence Partnership, we work with our 450 partners, and we act as a global platform for advocacy, for evidence-based action, and for investments to keep children safe wherever they are, at home, online, safe in their communities, and of course, safe at school. So to make sure that children are safe to learn, we urge governments and the international community to do 4 or 5 things. First of all, let's all leverage this incredible International Day to protect education from attack. Let's use it to focus attention, raise awareness, and ensure the political will and the financial investments are proportional to the scale and the impact of the challenge. Let's also advocate with all parties to conflict, ensure that children's rights are protected, including their critical right to education. Let's endorse the Safe Schools Declaration and, critically, implement it in a gender-sensitive way. Let's also support the complementary Safe to Learn initiative to end all violence in and through schools. And let's get governments to encourage and incentivize the education sector and child protection systems to work better together to meet the needs of all learners and to purposefully address the gaps that existed before COVID-19, but which have increased during the pandemic. I do think that right now we have an opportunity to build back better beyond COVID-19. And let me add my thanks to Her Highness and the State of Qatar for their advocacy to create this important day. But let's not just talk, let's use this day as the catalyst to seize the opportunity to build back better. Let's be intentional in our advocacy, in our action, and in our support to end all attacks on schools and all violence against children. Thank you.
Let's not just talk. A very powerful message. Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. Hindu Ibrahim, let me turn to you now. You're the president of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad. For the most vulnerable and indigenous communities worldwide, COVID-19, of course, has increased inequalities to services such as basic education, How can we work together, Ms. Ibrahim, in COVID recovery to build stronger education systems that guarantee education access for all, including for indigenous communities?
Thank you very much. So we all know that education is a milestone to build better future. And we also all know that the world's most vulnerable communities are facing 3 global threats: COVID-19, of course, climate change, and lack of educations. And before COVID, we know many communities do not have access already to the educations, and that including indigenous communities. I give you the example from my own communities. Being a nomadic communities around the Sahel, so you know that access to the education is really a privilege for those who are settled down and those who are having access to the big towns. So already we are getting marginalized, and that creating inequality between the communities and inequality between children, where they can become more marginalized even with the other children's them rights are not respected. And because of the poor educations, that mean also poor access to the informations. That's why indigenous communities and many other are most vulnerable to the COVID-19, because do not having access to the clear information, they cannot apply all the measure barriers that is imposed to protect themselves. And we know also the educations is the key for development. Mm-hmm. And when there is sickness, there is like COVID, there is no educations, so the poverty and not development will be increased in many communities. But we are learning from developed countries actually during this time of COVID. There are educations through Zoom, through radio, through televisions. But those alternatives are not possible in many communities around the world. Either there is flood, they cannot access to the schools, or other there is not access to the electricity at all, so they cannot have access to those educations. But how we can think, learn better to build better futures? We can learn from this pandemic. We can learn how technology is helping all the world to get connected, and how we can doing it in a second, that we know how we can change our life. So we can use those technology and give it to the most vulnerable communities to get access to the better educations. When there is attack from COVID or from climate or from terrorists, they can get at least access to this education. They cannot be ignorant. And we all know that the health of our planet is directly linked to our own health as peoples, to our safety, and to our development.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hindu Ibrahim, for highlighting there the opportunities that, can come out of this COVID-19 crisis in order to build back a better education system. And thank you for telling us about the experiences faced by the nomadic communities in the Sahel region of Africa. Let me turn to you now, Ms. Nijoni. You're the Executive Director of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, and the statistics are pretty grim. 22,000 students, teachers, and academics were killed, injured, arrested, or otherwise harmed in attacks between 2015 and 2019. What is being done to address this problem? And also, can you tell us about the Safe School Declaration and how we can build on its success?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you on this momentous day. It's a great honor. The Safe Schools Declaration is an intergovernmental political commitment to protect education during armed conflict, launched in 2015. 104 states, the majority of all UN members, have endorsed the declaration, which includes a commitment to use the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. And many states have taken concrete action to implement the declaration. This has saved lives and enabled students at all levels to realise their right to education. For example, the overall reported incidence of military use of education facilities declined between 2015 and 2018 in the 12 countries that endorsed the declaration in 2015 and experienced military use. In 2016, the Afghan Ministry of Education called on security forces to evacuate schools. Between 2016 and 18, military use of schools significantly decreased. Denmark, New Zealand, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, Norway, and others have updated their military manuals or policies to protect schools from military use or to implement declaration commitments. Implementation of the declaration has continued during the COVID-19 crisis. In Mali, in June, the Ministry of Education called on the Ministry of Defense to respect the spirit of the guidelines and not use closed schools for military purposes. In Burkina Faso, the Minister of Education announced in May that COVID-19 related distance learning would extend to students affected by conflict. These and many other examples show how the Safe Schools Declaration has served as a catalyst in preventing and responding to attempted education. The global health crisis offers an opportunity to ensure that all back-to-school campaigns and related policies incorporate the Safe Schools Declaration commitments and include students impacted by attacks on education. We must seize this opening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Nijon, for your remarks. Let's now turn to someone and hear from someone who's experienced firsthand what we're discussing here today. Muzun Al-Melihan, please tell us about your personal experience as a Syrian refugee and education activist. Tell us more about the difficulties of gaining access to education in a situation of armed conflict where education is under deliberate and systemic attack.
First of all, thank you so much, Foley. First of all, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Actually, I have lived these difficulties myself during the conflict in Syria, as I have witnessed many schools were attacked, which led to many of the children to be out of school or even losing their lives. I also, during working with UNICEF as a goodwill ambassador, this has enabled me to witness how the attack on education have had impact the lives of many in countries like Chad and Mali. We know the protracted nature of conflict today affects the futures of entire generations of children, especially their education. Therefore, investing in education during emergencies helps to provide the stability and opportunities that the children need to cope with loss, fear, stress, and violence. Ladies and gentlemen, today is an important day for protecting education from attacks. We must work together. So the attacks on education must stop, including attacks on and threats to students, teachers, in schools, as well as the use of schools for military purposes. Everything children want is to learn and to be safe. This is their right. So we cannot learn when we are afraid. And I have lived this when I was going to school during the war in Syria. And I know how difficult it is to go to school and everything that you are thinking about is your safety. It is more than enough to keep witnessing the attacks on education, and this must stop. So thanks indeed to all of you, especially to Her Highness Sheikh Hamoza bint Nasser, for starting this journey to end these attacks. Thank you so much, and shukran jazilan.
Shukran. Thank you so much, Muzun, for sharing your experience with us. And thank you to the rest of the panel for their informative and timely remarks. I believe we have time now for a few questions from our online audience who are watching us from around the world. I have a question first to you, Ms. Hindu Ibrahim, President of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad. You talked about the Sahel region in your remarks. and that's where you come from. Insecurity is a growing threat to security and education in the Sahel, and security issues are responsible for the closure of many schools, leaving thousands of children out of school. How do we fight that? Tell us more about that and what you think the solutions are.
Thank you. We already know there are some studies that showing more than 3 million children in West Africa and Central, all the Sahel regions, who do not have access to the education just because of the terrorist attack to the school. And we all know about the famous movement of bring our girls back. It is a reality. They can attack the school, teachers, or young just to prevent them to go to school. I would like to say here, we need to integrate an approach to prevent attack to the educations. Because its school or education system are clear target of the terrorist groups or fundamentalists, because they know that if people get educated, they are aware, they can fight, they can have all the needs that they want. They cannot buy them to join these ideas. And I think this is not the future I want for my peoples in the Sahel. So what we need, the solutions are there. Firstly, we need to fight and bring back the peace and security. Stability is very important to eradicate the poverty first. And the key are the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal by 2030. If we achieve that, we can achieve what we want as securities. And today, the main action at the international level first to our regions are two pillars: humanitarian response to give food when there is attack, or military response to keep peace building. But they forget about the most important pillars, who is a development. Development in the rural areas, because more than 70–80% of the population depend from the land, territories, and resources. So if they give them the development, they must ensure how they can get access to the fair education. And I am now calling for support to the sustainable economic growth in the Sahel, to develop the Sahel regions, give access to the most of 50% younger generation to the education, because it's the only way to build last and peace education for all.
Indeed, eradicate poverty, bring back peace, and that will ensure security. Thank you very much, Hindu Ibrahim, for those remarks. Another question here. This one is for the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, Ms. Janini. And this question is relating to countries, host countries of refugees, if you will. Turkey has been working hard in ensuring refugees have access to education and are granted the same opportunities as they would in their homeland. What can be done to encourage this approach on a global scale?
Well, thank you for the question. Let me first of all commend Turkey as an excellent example of inclusion of refugees into the national system, as you said. And I like to recall a bit the Global Compact of Refugees, which calls on governments to ensure inclusion of refugees in international education systems. And this is about scaling up worldwide these practices. UNESCO pledged to the Global Refugee Forum last December to support member states. And what we are doing definitely is about three different layers. First, mapping good practices. Turkey is one of the examples we could see and share, and as a practice to be eventually replicated or adapted in the context. Second is providing policy guidance and advice, and this is about the how to adapt. We have to move to adapt education systems and include refugees. And third point I care very much is about really and concretely establishing mechanisms for recognition of higher learning achievements and qualification. Let me conclude mentioning a concrete example of that about UNESCO last year launching the so-called UNESCO qualification passport. What is about? About a system of recognition of qualification, degrees, competencies somehow whatever you did in your life before, and not being able to bring your papers or diplomas once you flee in another country suddenly. And this is very much important. This is a very concrete tool, a solution, and this is also very much about ensuring the right education to everybody. And UNESCO is the guardian of education as a human right. So thanks for organizing the meeting.
Thank you for your response. So there are indeed solutions to integrate refugees into the education system of host countries. Another question here, this one is for the UN Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, Ms. Gamba. The question is, Ms. Gamba, how can the international community support your efforts to find innovative solutions to intervene as early as possible before there's a serious violation of international law, so that we can protect the rights to education of children in conflict, in conditions of armed conflict?
Yes, are never more needed than today, because today, as the fight against COVID-19 continues, children in war zones are even more vulnerable to violence, and their hope for an education further diminishes. So what we need is the international community, parties to armed conflict, and local communities to prioritize the protection of children and the prevention of violations against children. So I do appeal to all parties to conflict to make concrete commitments to end attacks on schools and refrain from military use of these facilities. And I appeal to all member states to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration to guarantee that schools be protected spaces. Lastly, I really appeal to the donor community to provide human and financial resources to reinforce the presence work of child protection experts and officials on the ground. We do need also to raise public awareness to make attacks on schools and education a thing of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Gamba, for your answer to that question. Dr. Taylor, Executive Director of the End the Violence Partnership, a question for you here on what more can the private sector do to work in partnership with UN agencies, civil society, and NGOs to ensure that the most vulnerable children can access quality education?
Yeah, through our Pathfinding Country Initiative and through Safe to Learn and Safe Online, the End Violence Partnership works very closely with the private sector to end violence against children in all settings, as I said earlier, at home, at school, in community, and online. And we see the private sector help strengthen advocacy and action and can be a critical partner, I believe, with a shared vision and the mission that we're discussing today. Let me give 4 brief examples. First, the private sector has huge reach. Businesses we know can use their networks, their infrastructure, their staff, their consumer connections to share information, raise awareness, and help promote and ensure quality learning, including online learning. Second, the private sector can help provide critical services. For example, working closely with governments and educators to improve access to digital devices and internet connectivity for all children, including the most vulnerable, to make sure that there is continued and safe access to learning. Third, the private sector investments we know can be catalytic. Businesses can ensure that their initiatives they support are conflict sensitive and they can address various dimensions of a child's right to education, including safe access for children in a safe learning environment. And fourth, the private sector can provide evidence, data, insights, which will inform the policies, the practice, the design of strategies which go to scale to address violence against children and ensure a quality education for all. I do think that collaborating across all sectors, including the private sector, we really can protect education from attack. We know what it takes, so I would advocate that we should take what we know, raise awareness, inspire action, ensure that every child grows up safe and secure and gets the education they need and deserve, wherever they may live. Thanks.
So everyone has a role to play, including the private sector. Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor, for those remarks. And finally, I think, time for one last question, and this one goes to Diani Joan, the Executive Director of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. Somalia, Ms. Joan, endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration in 2015. What are the priorities of your organization to safeguard education from attack within the Africa region, and what more can states do to support your vision?
Thank you. The African Union's Peace and Security Council has welcomed the Safe Schools Declaration and urged its members to endorse. Over half of all AU members have heeded its call. The remaining states should follow their lead as a priority, and all states should strengthen implementation of the declaration. A National Coordination Committee comprised of all relevant ministries is critical to successful implementation. Nigeria, Mali, and Somalia have established such committees, and other states should do the same. Another priority is to prevent military use of schools and universities on the continent. AU and sub-regional peacekeeping forces should follow the lead of the UN Department of Peacekeeping and ban the use of educational facilities for military purposes. At the national level, the guidelines for protecting schools from military use should be incorporated into military doctrine and trainings. An additional priority is to improve data collection on attacks on education and strengthen monitoring and reporting mechanisms. Data is critical for informing effective prevention and response measures, ensuring accountability, and offering redress to survivors of attacks, all commitments in the declaration. As countries often face cross-border attacks that demand a coordinated response, regional cooperation should be strengthened and good practice in protecting education shared. Next year, Nigeria will host the 4th International Conference on Safe Schools. This will provide a stage to showcase the progress being made in implementing the Safe Schools Declaration in Africa and offer lessons to countries in other regions to better ensure the safety of students and educators across the globe.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ninjol, for your response to that question. Well, I think that concludes our question and answer session. Thank you all for taking part. And I think we can agree that our very first International Day to Protect Education from Attack is a significant milestone, providing us with an opportunity to work to end attacks on education. I thank our distinguished speakers and panelists, participants, and of course our global audience who've been viewing this session on our live streaming platform. We need each and every one of you, to remain engaged and committed to advance this cause. So be sure to continue the conversation, connect with us using the hashtag #UniteToProtect, and also visit the Education Above All website for more information about initiatives across the world. Unite to protect education from attack, demand change so that our children, wherever they may be, have the future they deserve. I'm Fuli Batibo in Doha. Thank you very much for being with us today. Have a wonderful day.